Next, Southeast Asia on the Rise. Please welcome to the stage Nielsen's Vice President of Global Communications, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, Patricia Ratulangi.
Testing 1, 2, 3. This works. All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, actually. Beautiful day here at Park City and at Sundance. And I'm very excited to be here with you and with our panelists that's about to come up here to talk about Southeast Asian stories. So I was born in Indonesia, but I grew up in Singapore, so very much have Southeast Asia in my blood. And I'm really excited to first share with you, give you a lay of the land about Southeast Asia. I think it's a little known part of Asia that comes up every now and then. But just for you to know, right? There's 11 countries within Southeast Asia, many of which we are familiar with in the US through our food, actually. So the countries here are Brunei, Burma, or otherwise known as Myanmar, Cambodia, Timor-Leste, Indonesia, Laos, Malaysia, Philippines. Woo! Represent! Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam. And altogether, we represent 8.5% of the world's population. So that's not a small percentage. And one thing that, when I was doing a little bit of putting together the facts here, there's a lot of diversity within this group, right? Not just from country origin, but economically. So, for example, GDP per capita, which is basically how much people produce on a per head basis. Singapore, 83,000 per year, but in Myanmar, it's $1,100. Religion, which has a big, important role to play in how cultures are, told, are experienced and shared outside. There's very diverse religions across countries like Singapore and Vietnam, but very, more or less diverse ones, like Muslim-dominated Indonesia and Malaysia, and the Buddhist-dominated Cambodia. So there's also one thing, in addition to knowing about the diversity of the region, right? There's also a lot of migration that happens, not just across borders internationally, but within the region itself. And it's primarily driven a lot, if you think about the countries involved here, right? Healthcare workers, domestic workers, as well as construction, and also driven by political instability. In addition, which I didn't really know a lot about, was some of the impacts of global warming. So for example, in 2019, 5 million people from the Philippines, Indonesia, and Myanmar were displaced due to either volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, or flooding. 5 million people, that's like if LA and Chicago had to move completely, okay? So let's boil this down to what it means in the US. In the US, based on the last census data, about 3% of people here identify as having Southeast Asian origin. And 22% say they speak more than just one language. So these are things to keep in mind when you think about the kinds of stories that we are hearing, content that we are consuming, as well as what we as part of this media entertainment industry need to think about when we are bringing to bear the stories that we're telling, as well as what we're investing in. So without further ado, let me introduce our panelists here who are going to contribute from their variety of experiences as well as narratives, personal narratives themselves. So first up is Geena Rocero. She is a producer, trans rights activist, author of Horse Barbie. I just started reading it. It is great. If you haven't picked it up, start doing so right now. She's a 4-time Emmy-nominated producer-director, as well as 2023's Glamour Woman of the Year. I gotta learn that. I'm like spewing data. Anyway, next up is Tony Bui. Writer, director, producer. His movie, 3 Seasons, is celebrating its 25th anniversary right here at Sundance. And he's developed and worked on projects for NBC, Warner Brothers, Discovery, HBO. And he is an artist in residence at Columbia University, as well as teaches in his graduate film program. So, hello, Tony. And last but definitely not least, Grace Moss. Woo. Fan favorite. Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Warner Brothers Discovery. She is, involved with a lot of the talent development as well as inclusion work in Warner Brothers Discovery, as well as in her previous role at NBC Entertainment, and was a development executive at Style Network. So I think I have to sit down too. Okay. So let me start a little bit with each of you giving us a little bit about your personal backgrounds and what are some of the cultural, customs or traditions that you hold dear.
I'll start. So I guess a context here. I was born and raised in the Philippines. I left when I was 17 years old. And in the context of, this memoir, Horse Barbie, that I've just written, it was my way to honor that experiences, my culture, my migration story. But more so, as a proud transgender Filipina, what it means for me to center that culture, particularly, in the Philippines, we have a very mainstream culture of transgender beauty pageants. And those transgender beauty pageants that we have in the Philippines, Philippines is a predominantly Catholic religion. So when we do celebrate Catholic saints and patrons, different fiestas all over the Philippines, usually that's like a 5-day celebration. And on the main event on a Sunday, the main event on a Catholic celebration is a transgender beauty pageant, right? So that's the culture that I came from, where from a Western lens, the first thing people would say, oh, you mean it's accepted, it's part of the culture, I think writing this book offers that nuance, because in as much as it was very, very much part of society, these trans pageants happen from the mountain regions to national television where the whole family is watching. Like we go to church on Sunday, right? We have this trans pageant called Super Sirena, which is Super Mermaid. We go to church on Sunday at 12 p.m. and at 1 p.m. this variety show of trans beauty pageants, the whole family is watching it. It's that mainstream, but we don't have political recognition. There are no rights for trans people in the Philippines. So it's complicated. So I bring that with me. That's where I came from, because in the Western context about trans identity and let's just say identity politics, it was when I moved to America that when I first felt like shame, let's just say it, because in the Philippines, I'm mainstream, here, and it's important to have data as well. Like GLAD Media has this data that, 80-something% of Americans don't know a trans person. Like we're mainstream in the Philippines, so I like to, in the work that I do, in the projects that I do, in my creative work, I like to bring that perspective with me, because I think the through line there is there's a sense of pride in being a trans Filipina where I come from in the Philippines, and I want to embody that as I do my work here in Western context.
It's great to parlay that into the personal motivation for the work that you do. Tony, how about yourself?
Yeah, so when you gave me that question, which I just got like 10 minutes ago, unfortunately, because I didn't know the question, but I was thinking about it, and it's interesting because so I came here when I was a year and a half, and I was 2 years old, and our parents forced us to speak Vietnamese at home. But then we would go out, I was part of the whole American school system, come back home, but little by little, sort of our parents kind of the amount of Vietnamese culture started to diminish, unfortunately. And so when you asked me that question, I was thinking, what is it that we hold dear? And it was a kind of a difficult question. Again, it felt odd to me that it was a difficult question, but because I realized our family did hold on to a lot of traditions, and I'm not 100% sure why. So I had to find a lot of that later on when I got older and went back to Vietnam. But I tell you, the one thing I do remember, and I do hold of value, is just the way we honor our elders. That's the one thing. I remember when we watched Coco, and I was like, oh my God, there should be like a Vietnamese or Asian version of that, because I think all Asian countries, and very much so in Vietnamese culture, we have our table, our altar, we put our photos of our ancestors up, I mean, if you go to like any pho restaurant, you'll see a little altar in the back with like the incense and stuff like that. And and we had to do that when I was a child. I mean, I had to pray to elders I never knew, never met, and was really confused by. But when you get older, you realize how impactful that is on you and how emotional that is. So because what they were doing is they were actually transferring stories to us and transferring culture to us by telling us about people we never met and will never meet. And we have this thing in Vietnamese culture called Gom, which is I'm sure they have in other Asian cultures, and I'm sure Latin cultures where that time of the death, there's a remembrance and you get together. It brings family together, and as they get older and more recent elders in my life are passing away, that's becoming more and more relevant. But there's that transfer of culture and stories. I remember since I was a baby, I didn't fully understand why, and I understood it later on. So anyone out there who's a writer, definitely write an Asian version of Coco.
The challenge has been thrown down, you all. How about yourself, Grace? What do you hold dear?
Yeah, well, also for some context, I grew up in Southern California in a very, very predominantly Asian American, Filipino American city called Diamond Bar. So even the neighboring cities, yes, go Brahmas. Even the neighboring cities, there's like a lot of Asian American communities, so it's very strong. And I never had to sort of deal with the issue of not seeing myself as the prom queen or the captain of the cheerleading squad or captain of the football team. Like that was my boyfriend who went to a rival school. He's Filipino, head of that football team. So all of that was very new to me, even going, or not new to me, but even going to UCLA, there was a very strong Asian American community. And it wasn't until I actually started in the entertainment business where I started to feel very isolated and not seeing myself represented. And something from my culture that I take with me that is very important that I grew up with is this idea of the Bayanihan spirit. Bayanihan is basically this idea of the community coming together to just help each other out. And there's this emblematic image in the Philippines of villagers coming together to lift a house because there's like monsoons and floods. And so everybody coming together to help each other. And I think that idea has certainly affected how I lead. As far as being very collaborative, how we execute pipeline programs, as far as working with different community groups and not staying in our own like WBD bubble, like knowing we have to lean on each other to make these programs successful and to make the town successful. So I think that's something that's really, really important to me that I really take through everything I do, both personally and professionally.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And after hearing these personal insights, I think I understand why some of the work that you do produce are the way they are. And it's really reflections of yourselves. So that's great. Tony, back to you and your throwdown about making Coco. Your work really focuses on Vietnamese narratives and that idea of intergenerational narratives, right? What, from your perspective, can Southeast Asian storytellers contribute to shedding light on issues like society, political, cultural norms? And when you think about how many Southeast Asians are outside of that region now, what's been the impact?
So thank you for the question. I think one of the most powerful things about stories is you can, and as storytellers, we can tell the stories that have not been told or haven't been told enough, and we can control our own narratives. And what I mean by that is, one of the reasons why I got into storytelling is because all I did was watch American cinema growing up. And every single film I saw about Vietnam had to do with the Vietnam War. And every single film in which a Vietnamese person was on screen wasn't even Vietnamese. They put anyone who looked Asian on the screen. And they weren't even speaking Vietnamese. They were just speaking anything, gibberish. And it just sounded, like, oh, that's good enough. It's an Asian language. It's close to being Vietnamese. And they're always in the background getting shot. Or it was a deer hunter doing crazy roulette games, and almost every movie, we were sort of the enemy, or someone who's in pajamas running through the jungles, and someone who could be killed off and faceless, no name, and then or basically the gangster in some other if it wasn't a war film. So that so the purpose of me becoming a filmmaker was born out of the need to figure out what was going on there, and then going to film school and realizing that there are more stories that need to be told. And then I just realized, it's like I can either wait for it or I can be the one to try to make that difference and tell the stories. And I decided to tell that, to do so. And it was tough in the beginning, and especially as a Vietnamese American, there weren't like a lot of people we can look to at that time who are storytellers. And it's amazing because, identity is so important in the sense that when you start seeing people who look like you on screen, it completely changes how not only you understand your culture, your people, but you understand yourself. And that was such an impactful thing for me, for when I made my films, when I talked to other people. Like you said earlier, I teach at Columbia now for my students. I actually teach a class on just this very thing, on Asian cinema, Vietnam War cinema, and how sort of Asians have been the way Asians have been, sort of portrayed in cinema and storytelling for a long time, and you can see how the different eras, how it changed, and how more recently, and through the work of all these, I'm sure a lot of amazing filmmakers here, and amazing organizations, including Goldhouse and TAF and everyone. It's just, you can see like the generations have changed in how they see storytelling, cinema, Asian cinema, and it's definitely getting better. So things are improving, and but still a lot of work to be done. And just more specifically about Vietnamese cinema, there's also really exciting things going on in Vietnam with Vietnamese filmmakers here. Pham Thi Anh just won the Palme d'Or at the Cannes Film Festival this year for his film Inside the Yellow Cocoon, which I think comes out this week in New York and LA. So there's definitely more acceptance, and with more acceptance, there's going to be a greater rise, and I think it's only going to go up from here.
That is really great. And that's a really good point, because originally some of those Asian or Southeast Asian movies or films, right, would only be seen on the festival circuits. But that's almost making more of a mainstream showing nowadays, right? And part of that probably has to do with the fact that there's such a wealth of content available to everyone now, right? With streaming, with just a lot more investments going around internationally. And with the increasing in platforms, publishers like Warner Brothers Discovery is looking for ways to fill those new platforms that's available. So, for example, our Nielsen data, right, we see that there has been an increase in the number of titles showing up in US, UK, Canada, Mexico, and Germany, just 5 specific countries. It was at 1.9 million in 2021, and it's gone up to 2.7 million titles in just 2 years in 2023. So there's a lot of opportunity for growth there, like yours, Tony, right? And I have to share this because this was something that I just met Dua Mua, who is Thai, and he did this movie called The Harvest, which was also about intergenerational binds between father and son. Things like that are surfacing now that I would never have come across because I'm not a big festival circuit goer, except now at Sundance. For all of you, how has the opportunity for creating more content, right, impacted the careers of Southeast Asian creatives that you work with?
I think I want to add, it's important that we're talking about, representation, as I've mentioned earlier, in the Philippine context, that we are so mainstream, but we're not politically recognized. I think we're having this conversation right now about like LGBT stories that are being told right now, especially in Hollywood. GLAAD Media just released this yearly study index called Studio Responsibility Index, where even though we see that there's more conversations about LGBT folks, trans folks, the data suggests otherwise. In the last year where they looked at the data of like 119 LGBT women, 7 trans women is on that screen, but on that screen it's like less than 5 minutes. So as a creator, as a producer, as a writer, I'm always interested in not just what we see, but how that story is produced, who's telling the story, because I care about like the equity of that long term, so that when, as let's just say marginalized folks, when we see stories that are being told and then we question it, we don't always want to be in defensive that they've done it wrong, right? And then it comes down to who's telling the story and the equity around that. For me, I became a filmmaker during the pandemic. At the beginning of the pandemic, I was seeing a lot of conversations about frontline workers, and it was during the time of May 31st is International Trans Day of Visibility. And I have a lot of trans Filipino sisters that are nurses. And I was not seeing their perspective. So I started reaching out and I started telling them, like, can I tell your story? In what way? And that evolved into, and alluding to what you're saying about having our own perspective. I did this docuseries with PBS called Caretakers, and really expanding the conversation about what does caretaking mean. Like for us Filipinos, we know, it's embedded in our culture. Grace talked about bayanihan. We also have this thing called kapwa, which is a word about you don't exist as an individual. So even when I moved to America, where I heard this thing called individualism, it's like, what is that? In the Philippines, right, kapwa means your inner self is always reflected on other people. Like, you don't exist as an individual. So when I had the opportunity to direct this docuseries, and I said, let me expand the conversation about what it means to be a caretaker, and not just like being in frontline, in the hospitals, though that's something to address. We were seeing a lot of Filipino nurses. There's only 4% Filipino nurses all over America, but 40% of the nurses' deaths are Filipinos. Right? So I wanted to center those stories, women like, I did this episode profile of this woman named Belinda Ellis, who left Philippines as a nurse in her first job during the Iran-Iraq War. After that, she went to United States, started working at Bellevue Hospital during the AIDS epidemic. And then she was the lead nurse at Elmhurst Hospital in Queens, which is the epicenter. And when I started talking to her, she's just like any other tita that I know. Like, she does this crazy, traumatic work, and all she wants to do, just want to go dancing with her girlfriends. And it's like, and when we started putting it together, let me do some references of like Wes Anderson, which is very like playful, the way the camera is shot. It's just to honor, that life and to honor from that perspective. Because if it's stories that's being told from our perspective, it's so complex and it's so nuanced, through stories of, women like Alexa Manila, who's like a drag queen and also a mental health therapist. Like, I want to see mental health therapy through the lens of a drag queen. Because during the pandemic, she can't do in-person work. Literally, her office is divided in half. During the day, she does, mental health practice. At night, she does like drag performance online where she does fundraising. Like, how does those two interact? And I think I certainly have not seen that. So the power in telling these stories from our perspective offers the breadth of stories that needs to be shared,
I love that. They seem ordinary, but they're actually extraordinary stories. And when you surface them in the ways that you come out with your stories, that's how you're able to bring that real experience to others, right? Grace, how about you? I mean, can you speak to some of that as well as maybe what barriers still exist?
Well, I think there have certainly been some successes, especially within our Southeast Asian community. Like Tony was saying, a rising tide lifts all boats. So, when series like Beef, when, Emmys, I think that definitely opens up the door for other stories to be told within the Asian American community. I think as far as some of the barriers, definitely the pace of progress is much slower than I had hoped, than I'm sure all of us have hoped. But I do think that I'm very optimistic, because even in thinking about currently, we have an actress, Elodie Young, who's on The Cleaning Lady, who's she plays Cambodian Filipino, she's Cambodian French, but just to have her true identity be part of the story, where she doesn't have to play something that is necessarily outside of her own sort of ethnic background. And the fact that got picked up for a third season, which premieres in March, I think is really huge. And, I think what's paving the way for the future to help expedite the pace of our progress are future storytellers. for the WBTV Directors Workshop, we have a great talent, Marie Jamora, who is a director. She, since doing the program, I think she's got nearly 10 episodes of episodic TV under her belt. She's now producer director. So she is such a great example of the future and the next wave that will really help to push these, this variety of stories forward.
Any additional thoughts there, Tony, in terms of maybe the barriers that you are seeing coming up? I know as you're teaching students, right, who are the future generation of storytellers, what are some of the, I guess, the advice that you give them, when it comes to, here are the barriers you might be facing?
Just, so the most important thing is always tell people when I teach is to find the stories that mean something to you. I'm teaching a class called International Filmmaking at Columbia right now. Actually, one of my students is right here, and they come from all over, the world, and they're all going to be making their films, and so it's just really about, I always say, I think I said it in my first lecture, right? It's like you have to find something that means something to you because filmmaking is very tough. And you don't want to do something because you think that's what's people are going to like tomorrow or in the future because you don't know it. You don't know what people are going to gravitate towards. So to find stories that mean a lot to you, that's what's going to get you waking up every single morning. You're going to hit a lot of obstacles that you're not going to anticipate ahead of time. And if you believe in the work you're doing, whatever it is, then it's going to keep you driven to do it and find the stories that you feel like you're contributing something that no one else is telling. Right? That's the whole point of storytelling. That's your purpose in this, I think, as a storytelling filmmaker, is to shine some light on some of the dark areas that you feel like not enough attention has been put there. If you can do that, I think you're always driven. You're always going to be motivated, and then feed off the energy of your peers. It's not you don't have to only be inspired by the films you see. And there's been, you said earlier, with streaming and with there's so much access now. People from all over the world can watch movies. I was on the jury of a film festival in Saigon earlier last year, January. And the short films are just incredible because of this access to Netflix now and HBO and films from around the world. And they can go on YouTube and watch films. And you see a progression of just the short filmmakers in Vietnam over the last 5 to 10 years. It's been amazing because of this access. So, so obviously, by absorbing content from around the world, but also, the energy you get from your peers is incredible. And it's an amazing time. I was saying to you earlier, Pat, when I first got here to Sundance in the 90s with my short film, I was the only Vietnamese. I think there was only a handful of Asians. There was it was almost impossible to find each other. And look at where we're here today. Look at this. This is incredible, And 3 days of panels. The space is amazing. So many filmmakers. And today's the first day. It's only going to grow from here. And it's remarkable. So.
Yeah.
I just want to pick up on what Tony said about the energy of your peers. I want to speak the name of Irene Soriano, a Filipina-American filmmaker who single-handedly, it's good to always be in conversation, but certainly to find someone who builds that community of Filipino-American filmmakers. You probably have been seeing a lot of also Filipino-American shorts. There's a couple that are showing tomorrow, and she's single-handedly I have to give that credit because she's the one, right, doing that programming and being intentional on making sure that we are in conversation with each other, because that's, it could really be a lonely place when you're at home editing, putting together the board, that act 1, act 2, act 3, you want to make that phone call. It's like, is this really going to act 2? You want that kind of dynamic conversation with your peers because it makes it a little bit easier. It's already difficult, right, to get something out there, but to have that support system is so crucial.
So I love that you brought me a nice segue into this next topic, which is about that talent pipeline. Tony, you're doing what you're doing within the classrooms to start from that building future talent. So you're doing this work right now, currently, Grace, with Warner Brothers Discovery, right? Why did you turn to Southeast Asian content, and how do you measure your success?
Well, I think for us, it's about all types of content, Southeast Asian included. The tactics that we have within Warner Brothers Discovery, I think, are really, really intentional and strategic. I think the fact that we have a whole department, WBD Access, whose main job is to meet filmmakers and storytellers and bring them into the fold, like that's all we do 24/7, I think is really unique and a privilege to be able to do that. I think another part of the work that we do that's really important is how we leverage the community. So obviously, we're working with festivals, we're working with community orgs like Sunrise Collective, Capes of the World, the CAMs, the Visual Communications, APFE. Like we have partnerships with many of these organizations so that we can tap into their networks to find the talent when we can't reach everybody. So I think it's really important that we're out and about to make sure that we are getting to know all the talent out there, not just those in LA or New York. And I think, too, an important part of the work that we do is how we support the creative talent. Yes, we do pipeline programs. Many networks and studios have them, which is great, and we're all supportive and collaborative. I think for us as well is that we really make sure that we are connecting the dots and putting in all the effort we can to turn these into staffing opportunities. And that's everything from setting up general meetings, covering writer salaries, if they need to travel to go on set, and we know that there have been limitations to send writers to set, like we'll cover the cost. If there's a director who has a family, we will give them a childcare stipend while they're shadowing for 3 weeks. So we really think about the talent. We're business driven, of course, but we have a talent first mentality as far as making sure that that experience is fulfilling, but also productive. And yes, with that, we actually have Access sizzle to share.
Ready for the real work to begin?
It's big, it's huge, it's enormous, you get me? Powerful. It's powerful.
I'm so excited. We're gonna make everyone so proud.
We will.
At Warner Brothers Discovery, talent is at the heart of everything we do.
Equity is so important. It's not about giving advantage to one group over another. It's about leveling the playing field. So every single person is able to access the same opportunities. That's what we want.
Diverse voices and perspectives shape the stories we tell and the future of our industry.
It's important that WBD supports diverse talent because that's going to be how we become successful in this industry.
But developing and amplifying underrepresented talent means going beyond the aspirational.
The better our stories are going to reflect the reality of what our world actually looks like.
Because real creative inclusivity requires real action. Change has to be intentional. That's why WBD Access offers best-in-class development programs designed to create new opportunities and cultivate the next generation of fearless storytellers and artists.
The WBD Access program is amazing. This program gives them the opportunity to be just ready for success.
I've just felt so supported. I felt really supported. There's just this synergy, I think, that happens.
It's about discovering emerging talent, providing tangible access to tools and resources, and most importantly, empowering people. Championing future leaders, storytellers, and artists.
Like the playing field feels more level.
Let's go, baby. Boom.
This is about bridging gaps and providing a real, true path into this industry.
Without it, I don't think I'd have a shot, genuinely.
As part of the company's diversity, equity, and inclusion team, WBD Access reaches a wide scope of talent from all over the world. Whether you're in production, post-production, animation, or unscripted, our programs are here for you.
To me, it's all about giving people a clear path towards a thing that they want to do.
With ever-expanding global reach already across North America, Latin America, Asia Pacific, and Europe.
What a gift.
We are always looking forward to the next big idea, the next cultural moment, the next great story, and the next wave of talent. Talent like you.
What is one word you would use to describe the program?
Innovative. Nourishment.
Magic.
Inspiring.
Community.
Acceleration.
Effective.
Transformative. Game-changing.
just share, I think that these pipeline programs are really, really powerful. Obviously, you talked about Marie Jamora. We've got Dan Chen here, who I'm shouting out. He was actually part of our director's program and also was recently announced as a participant in the HBO Docs Gotham initiative. So we're really doing our best to find the talent, support them, across all types of, storytellers within the business.
So thank you for also giving me a nice segue to plug Nielsen a little bit. And you mentioned all those lovely collaborators that, it has to be intentional. So partners like Kate Goldhouse, TAF, we've been working with them as part of our efforts to improve the way talent is discovered within the industry. So Gracenote has a system called Studio System that is actually used within the industry to find talent. So we've introduced a new feature in the product called Inclusion Spotlight that helps surface these talents, these projects. And we worked with those partners that you mentioned for them to identify the projects that we should be highlighting. So thank you, to everybody here who's been a part of those efforts. Let's shift a little bit to then about how overarching, right? Southeast Asian representation on the various TV platforms has actually grown. I went to look at some of our data earlier today, and it was 0.5%, Southeast Asian talent representation, right? In 2020, it's now 1.4% as of the end of 2023. That's small, but I'm going to be positive and say, hey, that's more than double growth. Yay. And what are, I guess, for you, right? There's been a few things that's happened, like the strikes, right? That kind of shot down and it's been a bit of up and down. What are the opportunities? Can each of you mention one big opportunity that lies ahead for Southeast Asian talent?
I think for me, this could easily be said, of course, that's how it is, but it truly is be unapologetic in telling your story, right? Sticking to your vision. And for me, as an example, when I was writing my memoir, before I wrote my memoir, I was known in media. I did a TED Talk, went viral. I was known as an advocate. Yes, I am. But when I was writing this book, I made a conscious decision to honor. I know I've lived a cinematic life, trans pageants and Catholicism. You can't be more cinematic than that. So I think I'm excited to support, particularly trans Filipino creators, trans creators that are out there, Filipino creators that are out there that are being unapologetic in those stories. Filmmaking is naturally a collaborative experience. I've had my fair share of experience of, fighting for those vision, because at the end of the day, that is your vision and stick with that, And there's some definitely ways and some of the things, but it's so important. So I'm really excited when I'm in conversation with people that are, if you're in a creative space, you just know that this is from that very unapologetic tone, the voice that is so themselves. So I'm excited to support all those initiatives that have that. So.
Can I add, I think I second that. I think leaning into your voice, your specific identity and embracing it is really key. I work with a lot of young writers, and in a program, there's a Vietnamese American comedy writer who wrote this great pilot about his family and was being advised by his agents to not make it Vietnamese American and just make it a white family. And he was considering it because obviously he wants to get staffed, he wants to be successful in this, industry. And I was like, no, that's what's going to make it unique, right? The more specific, the more universal it can be. And so I think to lean into that is really key. And I think a great example of it, we have this series on HBO last week tonight with John Oliver. And there's this Filipino-American writer, Mark Kramer, who's also a product of Pipeline programs. He actually was one of the key writers for their Asian American episode during the Stop Asian Hate movement a couple years ago. And I remember watching that episode, and because he was penning it, there was a whole segment about Jollibee, who's the Filipino McDonald's, and it was just Jollibee. It was like this viral clip of Jollibee dancing at this kid's birthday party, getting kind of freaky. But I was like, oh my gosh, Jollibee is on HBO, And I just think again, that episode is the one that was submitted to win the Emmy. And so I think that's such a great example of folks just leaning into it. Don't be, be unapologetic about your, the stories that you want to tell. And I think ultimately that will lead you to success.
Yeah, so, only thing I want to add is, a little controversial. I don't know why it should be, but it's, I think we have this, I think all Asian Americans, Asians, always talk about, oh, we want to, see more films that look like us or people represent us. And then a film comes out, and it's actually astonishing how few of these people didn't go out and watch these movies. And that's something that's really troubling. So there's this talk that we needed, and then there isn't enough support, I think, where people come out and watch. And so I would say if, a film from the Philippines, from Vietnam, from anywhere comes out, go out and watch it. Even if it's not perfect, I hear this, oh, it's not that good, or this and that. And it's weird to me because you have to watch it, support it, to get that next, to start for filmmakers to start leveling up, financiers to start putting more money into it, to get those stories out there. Because if you don't have the support from the ground level, it's never going to rise from there, right? So, and then the other thing too is, if there's a little bit of a flaw, it shouldn't ruin all the films of that country. Meaning the room to fail is so, it's so low for Asian films and new films, especially from Southeast Asian countries. Where let's just say, a film comes out by a white filmmaker, and if it's bad, no one goes, oh my God, all the films from white people are going to be bad. You know what I mean? But if one film comes out by a Vietnamese filmmaker, another filmmaker, it's bad. That's it. The whole country, it's all bad. And then the support just drops right away. We're going to see that now with The Sympathizer. The authors Viet Thanh Nguyen, HBO, A24 is going to come out. Big budget. If it doesn't do well, I guarantee the Vietnamese book is going to get made. And that's a shame, right? It's because there's no room to fail. And that's where, the support of obviously Goldhouse and TAF and all that is helping change some of that. But to make those, but it's I don't know. It's just something that is something that's not talked about enough, and something that people should think more about.
Can I just add? I want to, in the spirit of pushing back, I'd say, this is why we need to have spaces like this where we could nurture talent, or we could nurture, the community where, everybody rises together, right? But just from my experience as someone, for many, 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 many years, when the beginning of that transgender conversation in 2014, being the only one in the room in many spaces, the burden of representation is real. Right, and you begin to question why you're the only one in the room, and I had this bigger question of how do I bring more people in, and in that context, just a context from 2014 to 2016, I was doing a lot of advocacy work, traveling the world, working with President Obama's State Department, UN, all that stuff. Right, at some point when you're the only one in the room, I got exhausted. And that burden of representation in the context what Tony was talking about, like, if it's bad, it's really bad. I'm sorry to say, for me, I don't want to just support because it's an identity thing. There's the other side of me supporting it, right? Is how do we make sure we nurture that other films we don't beholden just this one thing of representation, even though it's bad. That's my case.
There's something to be said there for sure. To both of your comments, right? We have to stand, because of the burden of representation, we have to stand at this center of advocacy, community, but hey, business too. Because unless there is funding, there is a reason for why there's going to be investment in projects that are representative and people that's going to be able to tell those stories in an authentic way. We're not going to improve that representation. We're not going to be able to tell the nuances that I think audiences that like us from Southeast Asia are starving for. But when the nuance is there, right, I think it gives us all an opportunity to bring in our friends, our non-Southeast Asian or Asian friends and family to go, hey, you know what? You know how we talk about the noodles mom makes? I'm sorry, I love my mom's noodles, so that's why I keep talking about it. You started making that, right? So come watch this show, and learn more about how it's done in the Philippines, for example. I'll get off my soapbox now. But anyway, in addition to that, though, how do we bring in more interest in the projects or the narratives that we're telling on feature films, right? And I'm going to turn to you, Geena, to share more of how you leverage social media and your other platforms to bring attention to the work that you're doing.
Let me just also just clarify when I say like when it's bad, like it's criticism, right? We need to criticize things, you know, because that's just I think an important context as creatives, right? To get to the good, we need to criticize. For me, you know, going back when I did this TED Talk where I came out as a transgender woman for the first time after being a fashion model for about 8 years, where the fashion industry did not know I was transgender. My model agent did not know I was transgender. So carrying that burden. So when 2014 happened, little did I know that there was this wave of this cultural zeitgeist about trans conversation, and social media was the first platform where I started obviously telling my story. It went viral. I started receiving messages from trans folks all over the world that in places where they don't have that representation, where they don't have those, just to shine a light on like getting rid of shame from that very critical thing of making someone feel something, valid, affirmed. But in this day, it's really, again, going back to like really owning that story that we're telling, and Philippines is one of the most active social media countries out there, which is, there's good and there's definitely bad component on that, but certainly it's about ownership for me. It's about ownership on those stories that we tell.
I heard that Filipinos are the fastest texters. I thought that like legitimately, like they timed it.
When we used to have, when I had Nokia 3210, like, and this is me traveling all over Philippines in pageants, like texting, a boyfriend in a different, all those things, I was a pageant diva, yes. And when I moved to America, I was like, you mean is the text phone is just beginning? Like, we use text everywhere, So yeah,
I think we have representation enough from various Southeast Asian countries, so at the break, let's all throw down here. Thank you for sharing that experience of yours. And one of the things I think that we love about being here is the safe space that we have in order to share and exchange our experiences and stories, right? That's not so much the case when we look outside. In the US, we live in tenuous times, right? I guess I'd love to know a little more about how you see Southeast Asian narratives helping to create positive change.
I think part of the positive change is that we're now not being seen as like this monolithic sort of community, right? With the nuances of the different stories that are being told, whether it's through Cleaning Lady or, what's the one, the Sons of, the one that just came out on Netflix. Yeah, right? Like Brother Son, thank you. All these different stories are coming out and we're getting to see more diversity within the API community. I think that is definitely something that will drive positive change because we are getting to tell just different kinds of stories now.
Very true.
I just want to add, in the context of representation on, what we see and how impact positive change from a context, again, someone born and raised in the Philippines, there's this thing in 2014. I'm pinpointing 2014 because so much, there was that, the Time magazine with Laverne Cox on the cover of Transgender Tipping Point on the cover as trans people. It's like, what tipping point, So in the context of the importance of media representation, and in the context of, we're talking about what's happening now in the US, what we see on the anti-trans hate, on the 600 bills on anti-trans policies that are out there. I like to offer the context as someone who is born and raised in the Philippines where we have that mainstream representation. But I like to say that the one that got me through, even before seeing the mainstream representation, is really the inter-community dialogue that I was having. I was lucky that I was from the culture in the Philippines where it's about kapwa, it's about, bayanihan, it's all about how do we help each other. And what I'm seeing right now in how trans identity, trans Asian, trans API youth identity are being demonized, that for so long, the conversation is all about, we just want to see it in media and things are good. Or let's just pass this law and things are good. What we know now, those things could be interchangeable and could disappear, as we all know what happened in the Supreme Court. I go back to that experience in the Philippines that at the end of the day, it's really, the work is within us, for each other, with each other, and that continued support, because that's the only truly the thing that would sustain us. Whether it's creating pipelines for creatives, whether it's creating spaces where we could talk about trauma, healing, difficult conversations, that's more the kind of representation I want to see more and more. It's really what's on the ground, what we're doing for each other in that way, and how that relates to what we see in media.
Yeah, to add to that, I mean, I think the biggest contribution that stories can have, obviously there could be entertainment, it can be, transferring culture and all that, is to create conversation. So I taught 2 classes at Fulbright University in Vietnam last spring, and what I was trying to get the students to do is, because it's still a restricted country, obviously, communism, there's still a lot of, like China, there's still, censorship and a lot of issues. So it's not a completely artistically free country. But I was telling them, like, you're not going to be able to go out and just easily write an article and put it in the newspaper about things that concern you in the country. But you can make little short films and tell stories. And in a way, it's kind of under the radar, but it creates conversation, right? It can be uploaded to YouTube, play into the cinema clubs. It gets shown among their friends and peers. And some of the short films that are coming out by these, young filmmakers are just, I mean, it's amazing. They're conversations about mental health, about abuse, family abuse, stories, had to do with, gender and sexuality and all that. Like, that was, unthinkable even 10 years ago. And so storytelling, that's where a lot of the change can happen. And then these stories get seen, not only in Vietnam, but also then, across borders. And you realize that, it's like Vietnam isn't just a country of war, it's a country in which, it should be obvious, but sometimes it's not, that they're going through the same issues, problems, and human struggles like any other country. But, that conversation is what's so important. So, what I always tell these students is, like, try to tell those stories that are, going to be challenging. And Vietnam is a little bit different from some of these other countries because it's not an entirely free country. And so it's interesting, when you make short films, you don't have to go through the same censorship process. But when you get to making feature films, you do. So that's where it gets a little bit tricky, And, hopefully that will change. But there are a lot of people in that space trying to do good work there, trying to make a difference. Anderson here with East Films, they're trying to do that, trying to bridge that gap. So there's a lot of people trying to further that conversation.
Right, I'm getting the wrap-up signal here, but so generating conversation, dialogue that breaks bias, changes perceptions, that's what it's all about, right? All right, well, thank you again, Grace, Tony, and Geena, for being here, sharing your stories, and thank you to all of you for being here and joining us.
Thank you.